All right, welcome. Welcome, Jill. Thanks for being
Thank
with us.
you. Thanks, Jake. Good morning, everybody. It's really great to be with you, even if it is through technology. We're all getting used to that, so thanks for that. And send you greetings from the East Coast, where it's cloudy and afternoon. So it's the middle of a global pandemic. I can't think of anything better to do than talk about safety planning on a Thursday, so I'm really glad to be with you. As Jake said, we're going to cover a lot of information in this session, and then I'm really looking forward to the time that we can talk next week. So let's jump in now that my screen won't work. There we go. So just a little bit about what we're going to talk about. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about a thinking process. Thinking is so central. It's such a core aspect of our advocacy practice that it's a good thing to think about and a good way for us to learn from each other. A little bit about safety and safer. I know this is the advanced advocacy training. These are concepts you're familiar with, but we'll just go through it a little bit and have some common knowledge and common discussion about it, about what is success. Also, I'm going to talk about mostly a framework of a victim-defined advocacy plan. This really gives us the framework to talk and have more in-depth conversations next week. I know that this remote thing has its limitations, so I just wanted to be completely honest and say we're still in the learning process. There is this idea, I think we can do it remotely, let's try. So that's what we're doing, trying by providing a lot of information this time and talking next time, so you can let us know how that goes. So grab your coffee or tea, water if that's what it is, stay hydrated, and I'll take you through the slides. Okay, so this is really what we're going to be talking about today, which is victim-defined safety planning. You can see this as an equation: victim priorities, their risks, circumstances, the decisions they're making about their lives and their relationship, and then our advocacy. And this is where our listening, connecting, and offering comes into play. And when we come together in that way in a partnership with survivors, we end up with a strengthened and comprehensive safety plan. This framework of an advocate plan is, I've got it broken down into 3 questions really. So what will I listen for? Victim priorities, how will we connect? And that's going to be very victim specific approaches. And then what are we going to offer? Often when we talk about safety planning, we really talk about what the survivor is going to do. And this gives us just a different perspective and a different way of thinking about it. This framework allows us to focus on what we are going to do, what our role is going to be in safety planning, and how we're going to accomplish that. So it's a little bit of a shift. Just want to say up front, this is not a new way of doing safety planning. It's just a framework to really help us manage all the complexity that we're dealing with, and to also help us keep our work victim defined. So particularly in this time of COVID, where I think we're all finding all kinds of things are quite disorienting, this is a framework that really helps us sort of focus and think about what we're going to do and how we're going to do it to help survivors be safer. So this slide shows the thinking process I mentioned. I'll just take it, there's 4 steps here. I'll just take it one at a time. So the first obviously is think. I know you're all thinking all the time. I just know as advocates, we often just don't literally have time to think, or we don't make the time to think. So part of this process sort of says to us, let's take a minute. Sometimes it's only a few minutes, and that's what we'll do today. And just think a little bit, consider and reflect on some things. Writing is a good step in the thinking process. Writing really helps you clarify or filter or commit to thoughts. I mean, obviously you can always edit, so it's not, when you write something down, it doesn't mean that's exactly everything that you're thinking, but it is a good step in the process. Sharing is how we explain things, how we learn, and we process things together. So we'll be doing some of that today. I've found, and I try to embrace in my own advocacy, just this mindset of being humble, of always being open to learning, to revising things. We know a lot, we're experts in a lot of things, but there's a lot of things we don't know. For example, survivors are experts in their own lives, and we enter into that circumstance, into their experience in a way that's really needs to be humble. It also gives us this opportunity for some self-awareness around our privileges, if we have those. Many of us experience both oppression and privilege based on our race, or ethnicity, gender identity, who we love, our abilities, those sorts of things. So this gives us an opportunity to really learn and grow. So let's put the thinking process right into motion with the first think exercise, which is about offering help and asking help. And again, the process is to think and then write. So in this particular exercise, I'll ask you to just take a second and think about your skills and knowledge and your life experiences, all that you bring to your work. Think about your strengths, but also where there may be gaps in your knowledge and skills. And then I'd ask that you would finish these 2 sentences with, I can help my colleagues with, or I need help from my colleagues with. And then through chat, we'll just have folks introduce themselves, and I'll ask Jake or other folks from the coalition to sort of raise up some of what we're hearing. So just a couple minutes, 2 or 3 minutes to think and write and then share. So thank you. I see somebody just wrote budgeting, yay. I think we're all focusing on that some now. Someone needs some help with staying calm in a challenging situation. I think we're all in that place right now. That's a great one. Thanks for sharing that one. Housing, language, great. Cultural aspects of tribal issues, great. I can see that survivors in Washington are in good hands. Look at this range of skills. Wonderful. Wonderful. Thanks all for everybody for participating too. And I'm gonna move to the next slide, but if you're still entering, please do. It'd be great to have these as we go into next week and have the conversations. So thank you. I just want to say advocacy is really difficult work, particularly when you have a victim-defined mindset and approach, because you never really know where you're going to end up. And trying to do it alone or know it all, you can't. So it really, this, this process of sort of thinking about what do I need help with and how can I help is a really good way for us to sort of share the burden of this work, and to not feel like we have to know everything or be experts on everything, or to say to a survivor, I don't know anything about that, and then not know where to go to get some more information. So thank you all for sharing about the getting help and offering help, and for doing the thinking exercise. All right. That's great. So just a couple of quick words on language. I do say the word victim or sometimes survivor of violence. I know that lots of folks use the word survivor only. This has been my choice because I don't want to lose the harm, the injury, the suffering that goes along with the violence. And I do think, and I have heard that some folks, when they hear the word survivor, there's this sense that the person is on the other side of it and she's fine. And I just want to, that's one of the reasons why I sort of hold on to those words. Obviously, when you're working with an individual or a community, you use the language that they use. Just want to acknowledge that some folks prefer the word survivor, and that's absolutely fine. A note about gender language, I'm going to talk about it later. I use 2 overlapping categories of battering and non-battering just for advocacy purposes. And since that's mostly a male partner using violence against a female partner, that's the gender language I'll use. Of course, there are female victims of a male or female partner and male victims of a male or female partner, and folks who are non-binary and kids. And so, obviously everybody deserves victim-defined advocacy, but that's just a note about language. And I do hear the phrase victim-centered quite a bit, victim-centered advocacy. I use the word defined because I believe, and you're going to see in the slides ahead, that survivors of violence actually drive the work that we do. They're not just the center of it. So just a few words on language. So our first poll, Jake, it's our first and only, actually, for just to be truth in advertising here. So just to take you through it a little bit, and then we'll open up the poll. So all the individuals mentioned below have experienced domestic violence. That's their common experience. And so one calls the police, and one files for divorce, another quits her job and goes to shelter. Somebody tells her partner to stop hitting her. Another person goes to a support group. BK is just 5 years old, and BK's father hit her mother, and the court ordered visits with her father every other weekend. And the last folks there, HN, filed for a restraining order. So I want you to go through and take the poll. I know you're going to want more choices than yes or no, but I ask you to pick one, and then we'll have a little discussion on the other side. Thanks, Jake. Wow, we have definitive results here about the police. Not seeing that as a significant safety option for that particular survivor, or divorce. Quitting your job also has some concerns. Telling your partner to stop hitting her, that's very much rejected by you all. Support group, also lots of no. The court-ordered visits and also the restraining order. So thank you for all participating in the poll. I know it was hard to pick yes or no, because obviously there's individual circumstances. I know that's what you would tell me if we were in person, and that makes sense. And obviously the level of violence and the risks and options differ. The purpose of kind of going through this poll was just to help us remember that our go-to strategies, because that list, the police, divorce, shelter, support group, those things, they're really common for us to refer folks to those as our go-to strategies. And as you have spoken, as your poll has spoken, lots of times they don't really increase safety. So that's just something we want to keep in mind as we're going to go through this discussion about safe and safer. So thanks for participating. That was very definitive, actually. Okay, so next slide. I'm going to go through these concepts of safety and safer. I know you're familiar with them. I think I just also share them with you because it's often a good way to help explain the complexity of safety and safety planning to folks we're working with. So I hope they're useful for that reason as well. Safety is obviously no violence, basic human needs are met, because we know that folks are not safe if they're homeless or they can't feed their kids, for example, don't have access to health care, such an important issue right now. But also that well-being is important, that people are okay and that they feel okay and that they're connected. Let's just look at this through the eyes of a survivor, through a survivor story. So let's talk a little bit about TJ. TJ was abused as a child, and that experience still haunts her, like for so many trauma survivors. She works minimum wage jobs. The longest time she's kept a job is 3 months, and she's not working right now, like lots of folks. She lives with her boyfriend, Junior, and he insults her, and he hits her, and he also is cheating on her. So if we ask this question, what does TJ need to be safe? If we think about safe as sort of this total comprehensive sort of perfection, one thing would be that we would need for TJ to have never experienced childhood abuse, that she has the skills and education and also an economy that gets her a living wage with living benefits now. Today, I think also of not being in the middle of a global pandemic. Obviously, there'd need to be big behavior changes in Junior or the money and ability to leave. And so it's not really going to be possible for TJ to be safe, to be completely safe. So when we use the word safe, and we use that a lot, victim safety, I think it's really important to be mindful that that's a standard that really is not achievable for most survivors, and certainly most of the survivors that we work with. So if we look at this concept of safer, where there's less violence, reduced level of violence, less frequent, less control if someone's experiencing battering, economic stability is increased. Obviously, we want folks to be able to meet basic human needs, but maybe have more financial resources or more stability, strengthening their well-being, looking at resilience and emotional healing, increased social supports, those kinds of things. This leaves us with a more pragmatic and feasible goal, a measure that really more accurately reflects what we do as advocates. And if we look again at TJ and think about this concept of safer, things that would make her safer, obviously trauma-informed people in her life, perhaps even trauma treatment, work or some other source of income, some big changes to Junior's behavior in any of the three categories where he's really being harmful to her, the insults, the emotional abuse, the physical violence, and cheating on her, and perhaps a place for her to live without Junior, even if that's not ideal. And this next slide is thinking a little bit about comparing views. So you'll see on the left-hand side is the victim perspective, and on the right-hand side is the kind of commonly held view of domestic violence responses. So commonly held view is that when we talk about safety or safety planning, we're talking about eliminating physical violence and the things that go along with that, sexual violence and those kinds of things. Often victims are looking for obviously less violence or no violence, but also economic stability, well-being. They want their lives to be better, their children's lives to be better, and so they might think of this concept more as being safer. And so because so much of what we do is about safety planning and we talk about safety planning, how we define safety is really going to define the plans that we're trying to help build and strengthen. So it's really an important concept, and you can see how there's a real sometimes an actual conflict between systems views of safety when the focus is exclusively on physical violence and a survivor's view of safer when she's trying to really address a range of things. So her goal might be to stay in the apartment and keep her job and have her partner keep his job so that they can pay the rent. And maybe she's in the court process either through child protection or a criminal matter, and then that focus is all about physical separation and physical violence, and those things can really be in conflict and actually make things worse for her. So we'll keep talking about that as we go. So part of what we do as advocates is explain this distinction between what survivors are focusing on for their safety and what is in their plan, and then this kind of more commonly held view and focus. It's pretty a narrow focus really around physical violence. I do want to talk just a bit about children and safety. Obviously our vision for kids is that they're all completely safe, that they have everything they need, they don't experience or witness violence, they have wonderful caretakers, people who are capable of nurturing them and raising them to thrive and be great adults. And obviously all kids deserve to be safe, but again, it's really not an acceptable reality, but not all kids have access to that sort of comprehensive safety. And we're gonna, keep pursuing that vision, but really it's also realistic to say that kids and the work that we do with kids is that they can be safer, that their lives are better. Because they are kids, and we can talk about this more next week, there has to be some standard, some adequate level of safety. I think of this as, you could ask the question, are they safe or safe enough or safer enough? It's just one way to sort of ask that question and think about that standard. Now, kids and kids' safety are obviously central to all of our advocacy because it's our core value, obviously, that kids are safe, but also because children, the needs of kids and what's going on with the kids is often really central to the adult survivors' decision-making and safety planning. So kids are really central to what we have to understand when we're offering our advocacy. There's so much about kids I'm not going to cover, so I just wanted to acknowledge that, but raise up those issues around safety and safer for kids. And let's just think about TJ one more time. We learned that she has a 6-year-old, Tommy, who lives with her and Junior. And then if we wanted to think about what information we might need before we consider whether or not Tommy is safe or safer enough, as with all families, it's very specific, it's family specific, it's survivor specific, it's what the partner or parent using violence, what they're doing, and the levels of violence is also really important. So we know that Tommy's affected by domestic violence because we know all kids are, but we really need to learn more about what the negative effects are, what perhaps some resilience factors or positive things are that are going on for him. And we want to know how he's doing, what his relationship is with TJ, what his relationship is with Junior. We can have this kind of conflicting situation where Junior can be a real negative, having a real negative impact on Tommy, but also be playing some more positive role in his life at the same time. And obviously, we'd also be thinking about supporting TJ's parenting as part of the mix. So my apologies in advance for the short conversation about kids, but we can keep talking about it next week. So just ending this section and thinking about safer and safety, having practical, feasible goals really gives us more ways to help. It's one way to think about it. There's more that we can do. I mean, sometimes it feels so difficult as an advocate when there's a situation where you know someone is in physical danger for physical violence, and it just feels like there's not a whole lot we can do. And I know we're all holding that right now in this time of COVID when so many folks are in homes and places where they are with partners and parents who are violent. But this allows us to, it gives us a lot more options on how to help and how to really have an impact. And you know, as we're trying to make things better for individual survivors, we are obviously still holding on to our vision and our larger work of having everyone be having everyone be safe. So this is like at a place in the training where I would say, does anybody have any questions? And we would talk, but I'm just gonna move right along. Okay. So I'm going to move from safety and safer and really get into this concept of the advocate plan for victim-defined safety planning. The first question there is, what will I listen for? And as I said earlier, the simple short answer is victim priorities. They're not always easy to identify, but when we do find them out, it makes all the difference in the world. So just thinking about this discussion about listening, I'm going to start with a boat analogy. So I'm so glad that, you know, Washington is a place where there's a lot of water and there's a coast, because I have been in states where I use the boat analogy and people don't quite understand why I'm talking about boats, but I'm just going to take it that at least for some group of you, this makes some sense. So on a boat, you have safety equipment like an anchor to kind of keep the boat in place and away from danger. If someone goes overboard, you have a life preserver, and you might also have a radio to signal for help. In this next slide, this person who's in the water, somebody goes overboard, you're not going to throw them an anchor. You're not going to be spending time radioing for help. The life preserver is the proper piece of safety equipment to use. Similarly, if you're headed for the rocks, you're not going to throw out the life preserver. It's time to throw out the anchor. And just, you know, as we just saw in our go-to strategies in that poll that we did, and so many of you answered no, that folks were not going to be safe using those strategies, we can see that, you know, depending on the situation, throwing out that anchor, if it's the restraining order, or if that anchor is shelter, or if that anchor is divorce, it may not actually make folks safer. So it's just one way to kind of think about making sure that we're using the right safety strategy in the right situation. And we know it's okay to throw the anchor or the restraining order or call law enforcement or whatever it is. We know how to do that and when to do that by listening for victim priorities. So this next slide is just an overview of what's included in listening for a victim's perspective and priorities. On the left-hand side there, you see risk analysis, and that is included what risks are coming from a partner, but also just what risks are coming from life, and I'll talk more about that. And then in the center column there, what are the life circumstances? Is she a parent? Does she have money? Is she living in poverty? What are the cultural factors that are really driving her perspective and her priorities? And the last column over there, her plans. What decisions has she made about her life or her relationship or her children? And we will talk more about the decision around staying and leaving. This can seem like a lot to listen for already, but here's a place where I would put in a pitch for open-ended questions. I think of them as sort of powerful, magical things that we sometimes forget to use. I don't know if any of you have long intake forms. I'm going to guess that some of you do. When I'm in a training in person, this is where I usually tear it up and say, don't use it, and use an outline and just ask people and listen. Those forms help us, but they really, really can get in our way of understanding priorities. And they can also be really difficult for survivors who are experiencing the effects of trauma, because they don't tend to tell stories or what's happening to them, or describe their experiences in these kind of chronological or categorical ways, and that's what intakes tend to do. So it's always good for us to look at our intake and think about if it's really a tool or it's a barrier for us. So asking open-ended question like, what's on your mind, or what are you worried about, can really get you focused really quickly on what the priorities are, what the plans are, and they really can save time, which I know is really important for just about all advocates in one way or another. Okay, let's talk a little bit about survivors' risk analysis. I mentioned this. Oh, having a little screen freeze here. Okay. So let's think about partner-generated risks at first. So if you look on the left-hand side, you'll see two circles: battering, IPV, intimate partner violence, and non-battering, intimate partner violence. So the battering, intimate partner violence, that's the kind of classic domestic violence, power and control, domination, fear, those kinds of things. On the non-battering IPV side, you really have things like self-defense. And some folks would say, well, what's an example of that? Well, you could have a woman who slaps or shoves her partner when they get into arguments or have a fight, and the partner's not at all afraid. There's no control. There's no a limitation on, on autonomy or any of those kinds of things. It's still harmful. It's still not something you want to have in a relationship, but it has a very different consequences for the survivor, and it has different consequences for us as advocates. And I do think sometimes we try to make everything be battering and the power and control, and sometimes we're working in families and with partners where that isn't the level of violence. So it's really important for us to have a sense of that, and be familiar with that. The right side of the slide is just all the stuff you're very familiar with, the range of abusive behavior, physical violence, and then all the other ways that a battering partner might control. I just wanted to raise up here that victims might experience really different levels of violence. So one might be experiencing really life-threatening or lethal danger, and on the other end of that spectrum might be someone whose partner is really behaving like some kind of immature jerk, not really that same level of sort of terrifying levels of violence. Also, how a survivor experiences the violence may really differ. So one survivor might experience a slap or a put down as something, not as big a deal, still not good, but not as big a deal as someone else who might experience that as really life-threatening and understand it in that context. So getting that sense of that priority and perspective is really important to understanding survivors' risk analysis. Just one of the many reasons why we need to listen so carefully to the folks we're working with. So if you think about life-generated risks, this is other category of risk analysis. Many victims live in poverty, and poverty makes it more difficult to escape violence, and violence makes it more difficult to manage and cope with or even get out of poverty. This means like poverty is about survival. Basic human needs are about survival. These are not optional needs. These are things that are essential for the adult survivor and for the kids that are in the family. There may be life issues around health or mental health that have nothing to do with the partner's behavior. She might be battling cancer, or a child might have an issue. There's a lot of risk to survivors about inadequate responses from systems. Lots of survivors are failed by systems. Maybe a faith institution that asks what the survivor's doing to cause the harm, or a healthcare system that's having a battering partner do the interpreting, or also just a resource like my own organization, Legal Aid, who just doesn't have enough lawyers for all the folks who need them. These are really risks and part of decision making that victims have to include. And of course, victims deal with bias because of who they are, who they love, how they speak, their immigration status, their faith, their abilities. This belief, this mistrust really can have huge groups of survivors just thinking that we're not going to be there for them, that we can't help them in any way. And of course, battering partners manipulate all these risks to further their control. They might say, no, go ahead and call the police, or go ahead and call, no one will ever believe you because, you have a mental health history, or you are an immigrant, or something like that, and just use that to further their control. So I'm going to take a second here just to ask you to do another think exercise and think about what's on your mind today. Just take a couple minutes, think about it. It could be a worry, a plan, a joy, something like that, and just write down the top 2 or 3. And if you wouldn't mind just sharing one or that you're comfortable with, that would be great, so we can sort of get a sense of where people are at. We've got work stress, grad school, policies around COVID. I'm working on that too from my organization. Oh, balancing home and work. Yeah. Too many Black folks are being murdered. Racial injustice. Yeah. Open court cases. Oh, we got some joy. Daughters. Yay. Yeah. What is it going to look like when we reopen? That's family members. Yep. I'm worried about my 93-year-old mom. She's doing okay so far. Going for a walk. Great. Wedding anniversary. Okay. Hang in there. People have home projects. Feeling down. Racism. Yeah. Number 1. Fear of reopening. Yep. Got some worries going on here. Somebody's flying somewhere. Home remodel. Joy and pain. I get that. Yep. Yeah. The court's reopening. Rebuilding a deck. Son relocating. Okay. So thanks for all the sharing. If you have more, please feel free to keep adding them. The point here I just want to make is, and I'll kind of go to the next slide, but survivors too have all that stuff on their minds when we're interacting with them. You've brought all this to work with you today, to this session. That makes sense. We've all got a lot of things going on. We've all have other things on our minds, and survivors are no different. When we're working with them, they're worried about all that list that all those things that you've raised up here. Those are on their mind, plus other things we haven't identified yet. They have lots of diversity in their families and their concerns and all those things. They also have really simple things. I've met with survivors, and they're really worried about meeting the bus for their kids or something really, I'm in the middle of sort of trying to get them to focus on something really that feels important to me, but what's important to them is that someone's there to meet their kids, and really just sort of having that awareness. And that I also just like to sort of remind us all, and for us to hold that violence is something that happens to people. It's not who they are. And so just understanding the whole context of their lives it's so important for us as advocates to hold on to. So thanks for all the sharing, and to all those who with worries, my thoughts are with you. Okay, so victims' plans, they start with the violence, not with the first contact with us. Sometimes this is hard for us to embrace, but they've tried stuff. They've been trying stuff, and it's important for us to know what they've tried, how it's worked out. For example, if they called the police and they ended up getting arrested, if we then recommend calling the police, they're not really going to think that we know what we're doing, and they might not think that we can help. So kind of understanding that we're coming in the middle of the process, and we're there to help strengthen the plan, but there's already a plan in place. Their priorities are really going to differ, and it may not be physical violence. It may be a lot of different things that they're concerned about and would put first. And survivors of violence also have plans that have these really wide range of timeframes. They may be worried about something right today, or they may be thinking, I'm really not going to make lots of significant moves until my child graduates from high school, or I get my stimulus check, or whatever, something further down the road, or until my children are old enough that when they're on visitation, they're going to be able to tell me if something happened to them, those kinds of things. Survivors also have a wide range of strategies that they put in their safety plans. There's obviously the familiar things that we think about, like shelter and legal system and police and divorce and those kinds of things, moving out. But there's also this whole range of other things that it's just more important for us to understand. And I think now, when a lot of the systems that we rely on are closed or half closed or not quite working, these become even more important for us to understand. For example, they might send the kids away every weekend because that's when the drinking and drugging and most difficult times are for her, and to try to protect the kids. That could be seen as, oh, she doesn't care about the kids and she's sending them away every weekend, but we need to maybe understand that for some folks that might be a safety strategy. We do hear lots of survivors tell us about trying to be perfect parents, perfect housekeepers, all those kinds of things. And of course, we don't want people to have to live this way, but it is a safety strategy. It is a way they're trying to avoid conflict, keeping the kids quiet, those kinds of things. Sometimes they have a relative move in because they think that will have a, kind of a calming or an impact on the partner using violence. So there's all these kinds of different things that we want to make sure that we understand. Also, sometimes victims' plans are really minimal. I mean, a lot of the folks we work with, their lives are just chaotic and difficult, and they're living kind of moment to moment. They may be experiencing kind of ongoing trauma and also the effects of past trauma. So, it's a very different situation. They're just trying to get by. And so I just want to acknowledge that too. The other thing about victims' plans is they change, and they change a lot. I know sometimes we talk about, like, does she have a safety plan, as if it's this thing that happens and then gets implemented over the next, whatever, 6 months or whatever. Safety plans change constantly. A survivor's safety plan will change just as she's talking with you. You might say, well, you could come to shelter, but then you're gonna, the kids are gonna have this issue with school, or, and they'll keep making decisions just as you're raising options and then also analyzing those options with them. They might reject something or think, I could never do that, or I can't leave my job in order to do, this kind of relocation that you're talking about, those kinds of things. So they are going to change constantly. And that's not a failure of your planning or the plan. It's just the way life kind of goes. I think, obviously we've all learned, like, lots of things are going to change that we thought would never change. We've all experienced that over the last couple of months. So that's a little bit about victim plans, and just summarizing this section here about listening. This slide just sort of puts it all kind of together. So the risk analysis on the left-hand side, life circumstances, and then plans. And we're looking for main concerns, central considerations, the first or most important issue or risk. And sometimes the first issue is not the most important one, but it is something that has to be addressed first. And in the risk analysis, the effect of staying and leaving on risks, I'm going to talk about that. I think I'm going to talk about that next. So when we're listening about victims' decisions and plans about the relationship, stay, leave, not sure, this stay, leave decision is really essential to the direction of our advocacy, and it's really essential to how survivors will help us define our advocacy. The other piece I want to talk about in this section is that lots of folks really see leaving as the answer to domestic violence, like that is the solution. And that also has an impact on survivors. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that too. Just let's visit with TJ one more time and her stay leave decision. So we know that she's dealing with the effects of abuse as a child, and her family's hostile to her and Tommy. That makes sense. No job, no money. She and Tommy, 6-year-old, are living with boyfriend Junior, and he's paying for everything. We learned also that Tommy's father's in jail, and she thinks she might be pregnant. So TJ's not really going to have any option to leave in this sort of circumstance that she's dealing with. So then we want to, a lot of you, and I'm thinking also then about Tommy, like what about him? So, obviously it's the parent who's using the violence that's causing the harm to the kids. So in this case, it's Junior's not the parent, but he's the partner in the household. But victim parents are also responsible for the decisions they're making that impact the kids. But victim parents like TJ can't do something that they just can't do. That's impossible. So, you know, we might tell, and we might not, but child protection might tell a battered parent, you know, you have to leave, you've got to move out and get your own place, you have to get Tommy into therapy. And that might be really good advice for Tommy, and it might be, you know, it might come from a good place, but it's not going to be possible. So if telling her to leave when there's no real possibility to leave, without offering her the strategies or resources she needs to do that, it just really sets her up for failure. And when you think about it, it doesn't really make her or Tommy any safer. So there's a lot of difficult circumstances to think about for folks who are experiencing violence like TJ, and the limited resources as well. So the next slide is a chart of, it tries to lay out the risk analysis that victims do about regarding the relationship. And I'll just take you through it. So if you look on the left-hand side in the stay column, it's a little like a pro-con chart. You know, on the left-hand side, there's all these risks from a battering partner, but also from life, generated risks. So, you know, physical violence, sexual violence, all those kinds of things, poverty. And then you look on the right-hand side. So if the victim leaves, is it going to be the same? Is it going to be better? Is it going to be worse? So she's not sure. And the same risks can also be there. So, you know, obviously in this chart, each victim has a different chart and different analysis. And for some victims, the risks are eliminated if they leave. For some, it doesn't really change things. And for others, it actually makes things worse. Leaving can mean the loss of her home or income, her job or immigration status, child custody, her faith community, you know, contact with family, friends, social networks. So there can be risks with leaving. And one thing that this chart shows is that it can be a rational decision to stay. As advocates, I know we don't like this reality. I don't like it. I don't like that, you know, staying means that all of these risks and this harm is still happening, but that we also understand then that leaving doesn't necessarily solve things. For some survivors, it absolutely does. Just want to be clear about that, but not for all, and actually not for many. And there's a little red circle you can see up in the upper right-hand corner there. This really represents the focus of a lot of our responses and a lot of the focus of our policy work and other work, really focusing on physical violence and also on leaving as the safety separation strategy. So you can see how if a survivor is dealing with everything on that, on both sides of those columns, and we're kind of up there in the upper right-hand column, you know, upper right-hand corner, focusing on those things, how there's you know, there's a gap in our connection and on our connection with her. I also want to say with this chart, I've used this with individual survivors of violence when I'm trying to explain to a system about the decision making. You're like, look, this is what's going on. Here's what she's dealing with, and this is what's going to happen if she leaves, just to sort of make it really, really clear for folks. So why some victims stay? Well, we know these reasons, but I just want to go through them a little bit. Because, and again, just as hopefully useful to you as you're explaining to systems and others as we're doing our work, because we have to explain over and over again why folks are staying and why they have such difficult choices. So some parents stay for their kids. Absolutely, they stay for the kids because they're worried about food and healthcare and keeping a roof over their heads. Sometimes it's because they want to be there to make sure their kids are safe, because if they leave and then there's some sort of unsupervised access or visitation, they won't be there to either protect the kids or to be there when there is harm to help the kids through it. There are, you know, a huge number of survivors too who will tell you that they want their kids to grow up in an intact family, and maybe they didn't have that. But also there's a lot of messaging in our society about how kids are better off in a two-parent family. And there's really kind of rarely any qualification there, like except when one parent is being violent against the other. So some parents definitely stay for the kids. Some folks just can't. It takes money to leave, and lots of folks just don't have it. So that just, two households is just not going to be possible. And so money is going to be a real limitation for lots and lots of folks. I mean, and more so now as our economy is going through something, I'm not sure where we're headed. There are survivors too who are staying true to their own values, maybe a commitment to marriage or a relationship. They might not feel like they're justified in leaving until they give their partner a chance to stay. They may have come from a sort of religious faith where making a marriage vow is a really sacred commitment, and they're going to hold to that. They see this as a time of the for better, for worse, the for worse part of it. We want to understand those core beliefs. They're part of our responsibility to be culturally responsive. And of course, then there are some survivors who are trapped literally by partner, and they really, even if they want to leave, there's no really simple way out. I just want to say, like, I think it's important for us to help educate others that there's this language sometimes we hear. It's so disturbing to me, but victims are not masochists bent on suffering. They're not living in a fantasy world. They're not dealing with minimization and denial. They are just dealing with impossible choices, really horrible, impossible choices. Like staying is bad, but leaving may actually make things worse for them and for their kids. It can be heartbreaking. I mean, they might be making decisions about staying with an abusive partner or going home to like a homophobic, crazy family. They might be thinking about helping their kids with experience in being exposed to the victimization, or maybe they're, worried about their kids being homeless. I mean, these are really heartbreaking, difficult things. So when a survivor's making a decision about stay, leave, this is big, this is complex, and it's often, a choice between two horrible alternatives for lots of folks. So I do want to talk just a little bit about this impact on survivors when leaving is seen as the answer. So when victims can't leave or don't leave, some pretty bad things can happen. There's a lot of judgment and harmful labels that happen. So leaving is so strongly seen as the answer to domestic violence that when victims don't leave, they're judged as sort of doing something wrong, that they're not really worthy of the full range of services or protection. And so it's not just that people see as leaving as the answer to domestic violence, but there is this kind of view, and I think it's because we've done a really good job talking about what we do, that anybody can just call a shelter or call the police, and there's this incredible network, and there is an incredible network that we are, but it doesn't solve everything for everybody, and we don't have unlimited resources. We have, in fact, very limited resources. And so, it's not just a matter of calling the hotline and everybody can leave and get out and everybody's fine. Although we certainly do that for lots of folks. But also sometimes when survivors don't kind of solve domestic violence by leaving, they get sort of viewed as somehow responsible for not preventing the violence. And because there's this belief that survivors can and should leave, it's such a strong belief that the survivors that don't leave are sort of seen as crazy, or dependent, or sometimes her commitment even to her kids is questioned. It's really harmful. And I do think that lots of folks that we work with in systems spend a lot more time judging the survivor for not leaving than the person using the violence for using violence, who is, of course, let's just say, the problem. So, and also survivors who don't leave can really find it really difficult to find help. I know you've all kind of worked with somebody who's maybe called law enforcement a couple times, or maybe they've called us a couple of times, and it's like multiple calls, and the second or the third time, maybe law enforcement goes to the house, they're less patient, that court system is less patient, they don't really want to deal with what's going on. She still needs protection, and a response, because what we've done the first 2 or 3 times hasn't been successful in intervening with his violence. But somehow she's sort of seen as being the problem because she isn't leaving, and that just sort of limits resources and options for her. And it's really not what we ever intended. It's not just like neglecting them. It kind of can make things worse for them. I mean, sometimes leaving is an eligibility condition. Sometimes folks who have contact with their partner, I'm sure it doesn't happen in Washington, but maybe in some other states, they might get kicked out of shelter. They might get arrested for quote unquote violating a protective order, even though they didn't want the order. It doesn't make sense for them. There are shared kids and shared responsibilities and all those kinds of things. So there's a lot of consequences here. And, obviously we all would say that survivors don't lose the right to make decisions about their relationship just because somebody in their family is violent. So, questioning the decision of somebody who has an undermining and controlling partner can only just really kind of foster the self-doubt that he's started with her, starting to undermine her. And I've also seen this, when a survivor leaves because we want her to, really before she's ready and doesn't have all the resources and everything lined up, she can end up having to go back. And, we know then, sometimes batterers say things like, "You'll come crawling back." And so then she's done that. And now she feels like she's burned a bridge with us and has a little less resources. He has more power and control. This isn't something we ever want or intended. It's just kind of where we are for some survivors, and it's something that we just have to think about and be cautious about. And I know, as we're using a victim-defined approach, we don't have to worry about that because we're not going to find ourselves in that situation. So this piece about expectations of victims leaving, I think it's among our most important work going forward right now. We have to, we spend a lot of time creating ways to leave, and that's really helpful, and it's helped a lot of people. But we've also created this expectation. So I think we have to be part of this solution systemically around this messaging. Okay, just to summarize this discussion that we just had, leaving as the answer. So it does, obviously, it works for some, and we've been incredibly good at that. It doesn't work for everybody. And it also doesn't help the next victim, right? So she's out, but he's still, we haven't done anything to reduce the violent behavior. So, we think and know that he will go on to the next partner. And, as I just talked about, there's some really harsh consequences. We focus on leaving because leaving works, and it's really good and important work. So I just want to be really clear. I'm not saying anything negative about that. It has tremendously positive outcomes. I just want to raise up that it doesn't work for everyone, and we've always known this. So it's just something we have to kind of think about and embrace. So closing out this section of the discussion, leaving is actually not the answer to family violence. Reducing violent behavior is because violence is the problem, so reducing violence is the solution. The challenge for us is, like, we have focused on physical separation and leaving as the primary way that we kind of help people be safe. And this other aspect of reducing violent behavior is something that we have spent some time on and some resources, but I think it's time for us to come to it with the creativity and passion and intelligence that we can bring to the work that we do. We really have to turn more attention to this aspect of our work. Survivors ask us for this. They want him to, sometimes they talk about it as him getting help. He does need help. He needs help changing this behavior. It's his choice, it's his responsibility. And we have to have more to say than call the police. We have to have more options. They have to be culturally specific. They have to be responsive. We need to know so much more about violence. There's so much for us to learn, and what works and for whom, and how do we keep survivors and kids safe as that is happening. So it's just a really rational request when a survivor asks us to help reduce the violence. And I know we've spent time and resources in that direction, but it's time for us to spend a little bit more. We really have more work to do in that area. And that's like a whole nother set of conversations that we can have. Okay, so that's the end of that section. I'm going to move on to the next section, but I'm going to ask if you're able. I'm going to do it too. So hopefully you won't see that I'm wearing shorts. You might. Just stand up for a second and just take a breath and move around a little bit and stand on your left side, stand on your right side. This will be the equivalent of the 10-minute or 15-minute break in person. It always ends up being 20 minutes to half an hour, but just take a minute. All right, thank you for doing that, if you did that. In the privacy of your own space. Okay, so let's talk about the second piece. How will I connect? Victim specific. These are victim specific strategies that we use. So connecting is, it's powerful. It's healing in itself. It is an antidote to domestic violence. So, so many times I hear folks say, I couldn't do anything. All I did was listen and, validate what she was experiencing. Like, that's huge when you do that. It's so significant. It's so important. Connecting is so important. So it's an antidote to isolation and the control and all of those kinds of things. And obviously, so many of the people we work with are experiencing trauma, and we know connection's essential to that, to responding to that as well. Connecting in itself is one way to help and really important. So when I talk about building a partnership here in this context of connecting, it's really about sharing responsibility and tasks. I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in a second. But again, just a reminder that we're working with survivors of violence to strengthen the plan that they already have in place. We're there to make it stronger. Okay, so building partnerships. Left-hand side, victim role. Her role is to disclose information she's comfortable sharing, consider the information and resources that we're offering. She makes decisions about what's going to be in the safety plan, and she decides how it's going to be implemented. She defines the direction of our advocacy. So our role, also extremely important. We share our perspective on risks. I'm going to talk about risk review in a second. We suggest strategies based on victim priorities. We help analyze the strategies, and we may work also to help implement the plan. We don't always do that, but we often do. I just want to say, this is not listening to victims and just doing whatever they say. We are actively engaged with her, thinking, assessing, being strategic, offering our perspective. But ultimately, we may get to consensus with her, but we may not. And if we don't, she decides. That's the difference between victim-defined advocacy and other approaches to advocacy. There are some challenges to partnerships. I'll just go through a few. Time is one. Sometimes we have time, sometimes we don't. Service-defined advocacy, that's when whatever we have to offer is what we do. So we're the restraining order advocate, we only talk about restraining orders. We're the kids advocate, we only talk about kids. There's also our stuff, that's a very technical term. Advocate-defined advocacy is when we know what's best, and that's the direction of our advocacy, and that definitely causes challenges in a partnership. Our own reactions, it's really normal. We're human beings. We're not cogs in a machine. We have reactions. We get angry. We get worried. We get all kinds of things. Therapists call this countertransference. It's a normal part of interactions. When it gets in the way of our advocacy, then we got to do something to address it. That's time when you want to be talking with a supervisor or a colleague, getting some clinical supervision if those resources are available. Cultural competence is part of our responsibility. Does she think that we understand and that we can help? Our own life experience and culture can be a resource, and it can also be, if it's totally driving what we think and how we assess things, it can also get in the way. So we need to always be sort of aware of our own biases. We all have them, and we have to really be open to self-awareness and self-analysis and hearing perspectives from other folks, other advocates. They might see a situation completely different. That might be an indication that one of our kind of implicit biases that we all hold is kind of getting in the way of us connecting. Obviously trauma, normal reaction to an overwhelmed experience, her sort of triggers, and also we may be experiencing secondary traumatic stress, which can have lots of impact on our advocacy. That's another conversation. We can maybe talk more about that next week as well. And I just want to acknowledge that there are folks that we work with who are not easy. They are mad, they are angry, they have issues. We may not have what they need. We can't really give them what they really need, and they get mad at us for that. They might not be good parents. There's a lot of stuff going on there. That's again when I think it's really helpful to keep our expectations realistic, to try not to do work alone, but to work with other advocates, to be in connection, to try to be flexible as we can, and in whatever way we can, find a way to help. It may not be the usual way, but we can try to find a way to help, and think about it that way. All right, when connecting, victim perspectives about the partner can be really important. So try the pie. So intimate partner relationships vary greatly. They can be very brief and not very connected or significant, or they can be very long-term and emotionally and otherwise, very, soulmate kind of level, marriage, kids, those kinds of things. So a really important way to connect is understand the victim perspective on the partner. Now, just notice I said not the victim perspective on the violence, but the victim perspective on the partner. So let's meet Ben. Ben and Steve have a 7-year-old, Trent. They have some good times. They also fight about money. They fight about how to raise Trent. Steve's cruel. He puts down Ben and his family's culture, and he has slapped Ben. But Ben is not afraid of Steve. The humiliation and conflict, though, is really taking its toll on Ben. So let's look at what Ben's pie might look like. So you can see on the left-hand side, there's some parent positives, there's some partner positives, and there's quite a bit of partner and parent negatives. So it's just a way of sort of understanding, okay, the violence is obviously bad and a negative, but what else is going on in the relationship? How else does a survivor see their partner? And just so you don't think I've totally lost it here, like here's what life-threatening this pie might look like, right? So we often work with folks who are really experiencing extreme violence, and then the pie is, there's almost no positive at all, and almost all of it's negative, and so it could look like that as well. So why the pie? Well, as I said, it helps us understand the victim perspective and connect. We learn more about risks also, just kind of hardcore basic safety planning. It helps us connect. It helps us sort of work with the victim to assess if this is a partner that has any ability to change or not. We might identify safety strategies that are not our typical go-to ones. There may be options to reduce violent behavior or other behavior that's really hurting or harmful to her and the kids. It's also going to help us learn more about the kids. We always want to be attentive to what she's worried about the partner. It's a really different thing to go through that inventory of all the violence versus sort of asking a question like, how did you meet? You could really learn a lot by asking such an open-ended question. So he's the problem. So information about him is important, not just the violence, but all about him. Like it's a way to find potential other safety strategies that we don't always typically look at. Partners who use violence, I won't go through all of this, they're not all the same, obviously, and some of these interventions, substance abuse, culture, mental health issues, poverty, attitudes towards women and kids, like, you can have a substance abuse issue and be misogynist. These things can happen at the same time, obviously, but lots of survivors tell us that he needs help. If he had a job, if that structure happened, it would help, it would reduce things, it would make things better at home. And these are all things that we would want to explore with survivors about how we might increase the safety for her and the kids. Okay, I've got like 10 minutes, so I'm going to go through the last piece here, this last question about what will I offer. So what are the strategies for SAFER? This is a summary about reviewing risks. We identify relevant options. We help develop the plan. I just want to talk about this risk review a little bit. This is a place for really embracing respect and humility. So we want to understand her perspective, what her priority is, why or why not it's seen as a risk. For example, I know of a case where the survivor identified that there were guns in the house, and the advocate was instantly into lethal, life-threatening violence, safety planning. And then we asked about the guns, and it turned out like they were the grandfathers, and they were historic, and they didn't even work, and those kinds of things. So it's just an example. We have to really understand what's going on. Coping with no options doesn't mean she's ignoring the risk. So if her greatest concern is being homeless, that doesn't mean that she's ignoring the violence or the impact on the kids. It's just that her priority right now is not being homeless. We always want to check our own perspective, clarify, is she sharing incomplete or inaccurate information? Yes, we all share inaccurate and incomplete information. It's very difficult to, say something exactly as something happened, or to quote unquote tell the truth, is very challenging for all of us. And we also give victims lots of reasons to edit their stories. I can't help you if you tell me you're addicted. If you talk about your kids, I may have to call child protection. I mean, we give a lot of cues, and so do the systems, about don't tell us everything. And obviously we're going to try to form a shared perspective. And I'm not talking about lethality assessment or life-threatening violence, but obviously when that occurs, when we see those risks, or we see serious risks to kids, we're going to do kind of more, we're going to spend more time, we're going to be doing what I would refer to as enhanced advocacy. All right, so you've been amazing to listen, so I'm going to take you to the advocacy restaurant. You go to the advocacy restaurant and you look at the menu and you order pasta. So the service-defined waiter brings you the special because it's what they have, not knowing that you're allergic to the main ingredient. The advocate-defined waiter decides you need to lose weight, and instead of giving you the pasta, brings you the salad. The victim-defined waiter asks you what you want, learns about your allergies, and then suggests some options, and you decide on a meal that wasn't even on the menu. And wouldn't we all love restaurants to be open now too? So this is just a way to sort of separate out, like when we're being sort of more focused on the service, when we're being more focused on what we think is right, and when we really are truly being victim defined. It's just an analogy for you to think about that. So here's a summary of all that I just talked about around connecting and offering, building the relationship, reviewing risks, identifying options, and doing the planning. Just true confessions, I always say this. If you know me at all, you know I don't do anything if I can't put it in a chart. So this is a chart. And this is what an advocate plan would look like for victim-defined safety planning with all the details. So all the things I just talked about, I got it all on one page. And this is what it would look like if you were maybe trying to use it as a form instead of your 12-page intake sheet. And then I just want to make a point about victim-defined advocacy. It's both individual and systemic. So we listen, we connect, we offer, we strengthen plans, but we also think, plan, and act on a systemic level. It's not just like, oh, there are no options, and so we'll make the best that we can do. We do the best we can do with individual survivors, but then we try to fix the system. That's who we are. That's why we're a social change movement. And a way to think about this is I'll introduce you to Stella. So Stella's priority is her partner's violence, the harm to her and her son. And her plan is to end the relationship and go to court and get an order to order her partner out of the home. So she goes to court and no one in court speaks her language. The forms are only in English. So we help Stella get the court order. And then we also work with the court system to make sure that there is significantly increased language access. So it's just an example of how we do all those things. So at the end of the session, let's see if we can take a question or two, chat question or two. So trust victims. They're going to tell you what they need, what's going on, and their decisions. And then we also have to trust our advocacy in partnership with that. That would be the kind of overarching values I would leave you with. So apology for the speed talking and kind of talking for 90 minutes. I'm really looking forward to talking with you next week, and I hope you'll spend, we have a few minutes at the end to really think through what you want to talk about next week. We have some kind of gentle structure for those discussions, but we really want to be advocate defined in our response to you and the way that we talk about things. So you need to help us do that, and we'll focus on those things. Any questions, Jake or Eileen or Heather, you think I should raise up in the last couple minutes?
This is great. Thank you so much, Jill. And thank you everybody for being so engaged and spending your morning with us. Great. I'm just seeing a lot of thank yous in the chat, and thank you to everybody. Thanks so much, Jill.
I hope you have a great rest of your day, and to everyone who's saying thank you, you're welcome. Thank you. I'm really, I'm grateful to be in partnership with all of you doing this work.